Hello, welcome to the programming training on using RTI Authentication within a new project. In this session, we will discuss the following topics: preparation, system setup and programming, configuring the RTI Authentication dashboard, and client information entry and testing. Let's begin. First, make sure you have a 64-bit PC running Windows 10 or higher as its native operating system. Next, always check to make sure you have the latest Integration Designer's programming software on your computer. RTI Authentication is only available on version 11.3 and higher. This should be done automatically if your computer is online when you open the software, but a manual check can be done by clicking on Help and then Check for Updates. Finally, RTI Authentication requires a firmware update to the XP processor line. This can be done through the network or via USB Direct Connect under the Communications tab. Next, we will create a new project file. Then, add the XP6S as the main processor. Once we have added all the rooms, RTI controllers, sources, and page sets, make sure to go through the properties of each and properly configure them. For example, we have added the Genie garage door driver and will need to input the serial number and select the door assignment from the drop-down within its properties. Going through the properties and configuring is especially important if using RTI Authentication to ensure communication between the devices and the XP processor. Next, you'll need to check the processor to see if any of the source device drivers you've added require authentication. To check this, select the processor from the workspace and then choose Settings under Connected Features. Here you will see the following: System Name, RTIQ Monitoring, and Driver Authentication Dashboard. Let's go through these one by one, beginning with System Name. This is where we name the system for our RTIQ Monitoring Dashboard. We recommend you name this with the name and/or location of the client for easier identification within the RTIQ Monitoring Dashboard, RTI Panel Multi-Location feature, or anywhere else that the system name may be needed. Recommendations such as G. Jetson Home or the Smith Apartment Building 1 will suffice. The RTIQ monitoring section is where you will enable all your systems so that you can take advantage of our free remote monitoring service. There's an additional training available on how to do this on our website via RTI Excel. We highly recommend taking advantage of the RTIQ monitoring service. Authentication dashboard is where we need to focus our attention today. Under the Authentication URL buttons will be the information pertaining to any source drivers that will require the processor to authenticate the client's credentials. If there are no source drivers that require this, it will be stated as such. However, in this case, there is a driver that requires it, so we must upload the programming file to the processor before proceeding. We will click the Send to Device button and only load the XP processor file. Don't load the rest of the files onto any RTI devices yet, just the XP processor. The reason for this is that the processor itself, not Integration Designer, needs to activate and establish the authentication communication. Once the program file is loaded onto the processor, select the processor again from the workspace and then choose the settings under Connected Features. The authentication URL is what you or your client will need to set up the necessary sources with the client's credentials. This has two options: Copy URL and Launch URL. If we click Copy URL, it will copy the address above to our clipboard and we can email or text it to our client. They will then be able to launch it from their device and input their credentials for the necessary device. If we click on Launch URL, Integration Designer will immediately open the default web browser window and launch the URL. This page, same as what the client would see, is where you can identify and select the available source driver devices that use RTI authentication. We will select this device and input the proper login and password for the client. Keep in mind, they will need to have an account with that company already set up and configured with the proper devices. We can continue to program the rest of the system file, including the activities, user interface design and automation, as they are not dependent on the RTI authentication credentials information to do so. The final step in the process is to check the overall system for the proper commands, activities, automation, and feedback variables, and then test to make sure that it is fully functional, easy to operate, and exactly what the client was expecting. In summary, the process is straightforward for using the new RTI authentication. We build the project workspace with all the processor, rooms, RTI controllers, and source devices, configure all the properties for those devices and sources, check the processor authentication dashboard to see if authentication is needed for any source devices, and if so, load the processor file from Integration Designer onto the XP processor. We will then launch or send the client the URL to set up the sources and enter their credentials to allow authorization of those devices to communicate with the RTI XP processors. The new RTI authentication is designed specifically to help dealers minimize truck rolls, increase client satisfaction through greater security, lower overhead programming costs and labor costs, which in turn increases overall profitability. Additionally, this type of setup and configuration and authentication allows RTI to offer new control options with third-party devices that require this type of setup. Stay tuned for some really cool additions to the driver library. If you have any additional questions, feel free to contact your regional sales engineer for additional information. Thanks for watching.